Hey guys, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate it, thanks. Also, don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss a chilling new story when it drops. My name is Caleb Mercer, field geologist, and I didn't set out to find anything except the contact between two layers of shale and basalt. Alaska had other ideas. On the third day the storm ate my trail. Snow came in hard as thrown salt. The map folded in my pocket like a bad joke, and the compass spun once, twice, like it heard a command. The world shrank to a cold room with no walls. I rationed heat and breath. The wind pressed its belly against my parka and stayed there. White erased everything but the next step. I knew the rule, camp and wait. I pitched the tent in a shallow bowl, fired the stove, and listened to it tick. The flame made a small sun. I planned for one night. At dawn, the storm thickened. I broke camp and walked anyway because motion felt like mercy. By afternoon, the sky was the same color as the ground. My headlamp found nothing but spinning crystals. When I crested a low ridge, the beam caught a red flare stabbing from the drift. Another waited 10 paces beyond it, and another, each one a flare with its cap pulled and the stick planted upright, cooled and spent, yet bright against the pale. A breadcrumb trail made of warnings. I told myself someone had laid them for a medevac, a rescue route, anything reasonable. The line stepped downhill and curved north across a frozen wash. I followed because the storm finally offered me a break, and I took it. The flares led into a shallow cut at the base of a black shoulder of mountain where the wind sounded strangled. Between two boulders, a door waited, tilted, half buried. A steel slab with a frostbitten keypad and a word stenciled high in block letters big enough for a helicopter to see. Sector 13. I stood there with the snow writing shorthand against my goggles, thinking about how numbers like that never mean anything good. The handle yielded with a groan like a boat hull. The door swung against packed powder, and a breath of air came out that smelled of old paper, dry rubber, and something mineral, like a cave that had swallowed a laboratory. Inside was a choke point corridor with emergency paint stripes, all the color leached by years. My headlamp caught a wall clock forever paused at 2:17. Boot prints had sketched frantic comings and goings, iced into relief. It felt like walking into a photograph taken at the worst minute of somebody's life. I sealed the door, shoved the snow back, and dragged my pack inside. The wind turned distant, a fist grinding against the steel. I told myself I'd write it out and write a report someday. I used to believe reports could fix things. I made camp on the loading bay, ate jerky that tasted like leather and smoke, and looked at the dark hallway yawning deeper. The flares had led me here. What stayed with me wasn't the silence, but the feeling that the place had been paused mid-breath. A cart lay tipped on its side, a clipboard frozen mid-fall in a thin sheet of ice, as if the air had snapped shut around it. Something metallic clinked far down the corridor. Nothing dramatic, but too sharp to be settling pipes. I told myself it was nothing, but Sector 13 had a way of sounding like it was paying attention. The first thing I learned about Sector 13 was that silence isn't the same as quiet. Quiet is gentle. Silence has weight. The kind in that bunker settled on my shoulders like cold sand, filling the cracks between thoughts. I unrolled my sleeping bag against a crate stamped with a faded government seal, set my stove to melt snow, and pretended this was just another weather delay. Fieldwork teaches you to improvise, but it never teaches you how to shake the feeling that a place is looking back at you. I tried the lights out of habit. The switch clicked, but nothing answered. No hum from fixtures, no flicker, no dying bulb trying to be brave. Whatever power had once lived in those walls had gone dormant, long before I arrived. My headlamp threw long shadows down the corridor, black bars falling over the painted arrows and hazard decals. Some decals had peeled off clean, leaving rectangular ghosts on the walls. Others were scarred by what looked like burn marks, though I couldn't imagine what could scorch steel that way. The storm outside lifted to a low groan, the kind you feel more in your chest than your ears. The door rattled once when a gust slapped it, but the place didn't seem bothered. It had endured worse. I ate more jerky, washed it down with hot water, and told myself to sleep. The dark hallway was a mouth, open and waiting. I pulled the zipper of the sleeping bag all the way up to my chin. Sleep didn't come, not fully. My brain kept catching on things, details that didn't belong. A maintenance cart parked too neatly beside a wall, every tool aligned as if someone had stopped in the middle of work and never returned. A lab coat hanging from a hook, sleeve frozen in a curl like a beckoning hand. Boot prints crossing back and forth in loops that made no sense. People don't pace that way unless they're afraid of choosing a direction. Now and then, somewhere in the guts of the bunker, a metal panel flexed. It wasn't tapping, not the deliberate rhythm of knuckles, but the sort of sound old ventilation systems make when they're trying to recall their job. A long, thin buckle, a hollow clang, then nothing. The kind of pattern your mind wants to turn into conversation if you let it. The temperature in the bay dropped a few degrees around midnight. My breath fogged in front of me, even inside the sleeping bag. I checked the door again just to reassure myself that the storm hadn't ripped it open. Still sealed, still solid. Snow piled against it thick enough to deaden the outside world entirely. To distract myself, I wrote a few lines in my notebook. Night 1, storm worsening, found an abandoned facility, need to remain calm, investigate once visibility improves. My handwriting looked steadier than I felt. At some point, minutes or hours, I drifted. I woke to the soft vibration of the metal wall behind my head. Not a movement, not anything alive. Just a faint tremor, like a generator failing somewhere far beneath my feet. I sat up, listening. The tremor faded. My pulse stayed high. Something about that place didn't want me comfortable. It wasn't hostility exactly, more like expectation. I lay back down but didn't close my eyes. The dark at the end of the hallway felt a shade deeper than the dark near me, as if the bunker kept its heaviest secrets farther in. I told myself morning would bring some clarity. I didn't yet understand that Sector 13 didn't believe in mornings. Morning arrived only because my watch insisted it had. Inside the bunker, time felt like an argument no one was winning. The air held the same stillness as the night before, dry, metallic, slightly bitter. I packed my gear, slung the lamp, and told myself I'd scout the upper level before deciding anything else. If the storm calmed, I'd leave. If not, well, following flares into a half-buried government bunker wasn't exactly a triumph of decision-making to begin with. The main corridor looped around the loading bay in a wide ring. Doors marked with stenciled labels lined the walls like teeth. Infirmary, supply, mess, briefing, ops. I tried each one in turn. The infirmary was neat in a way that didn't comfort me. Cots arranged with corners tucked tight, cabinets half open as though someone had stepped away from inventory and never returned. A single glove lay in the sink, stiff with age. A tray of instruments sat beneath a dusting of ice crystals that had drifted through a vent above. I picked up a scalpel. The metal was cold enough to sting. The mess hall was worse. Trays sat stacked, plates left in drying racks, a pot on the stove with a long dried ring at the bottom. It looked like someone had been halfway through cleaning for inspection when the whistle blew to drop everything and run. A bulletin board on the far wall held laminated safety sheets. Someone had scratched a message beneath them, no more drills. The letters pressed so deep they cut into the cork. The silence tightened around me as I moved. Not oppressive, just expectant. Like the whole place was waiting for something to happen again. The briefing room was behind a glass partition. A projector sat on a rolling cart with a long dead laptop beside it. A map of the surrounding mine network stretched across the wall. Red thread ran from point to point, all converging on a central chamber labeled Cavern B9. A smaller note in the corner read, Void Site, Directorate Access Only, Void. Not pit, not shaft, void. That word followed me as I crossed into the ops room. This was the heart of the upper level. Desks arranged in a semicircle around a central table, notebooks piled high, an old radio unit with its faceplate cracked, papers curled in the cold, edges yellowed. I brushed frost from one of the notebooks and flipped it open. The handwriting was blocky and neat. Anomaly discovered by East Drift miners at 0420 hours. Visual disturbance reported. Instruments unaffected. Initial drone insertion failed. Recommend escalation to Directorate. pages deeper. Second drone attempt. Tether sheared, ends vitrified. No thermal signature. Volunteer team returned altered, eyes blackened. Subdermal branching visible. Aggressive behavior. Attempted conveyance of personnel to anomaly site. Neutralization authorized. Neutralization. Clinical word for gunfire. I read until my fingers numbed. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that whatever was down in cavern B9, it wasn't a cave-in or gas pocket or anything geology could rationalize. These people had stumbled onto something the instruments didn't understand and the human eye wasn't meant to see. A faint click echoed overhead, one of the intercom panels twitching to life. No whispering, nothing theatrical. Just a dry electronic pop and a thin wash of static, as though a microphone somewhere deep in the facility had been nudged by a draft. I stepped back, watching the grill. The static rose a hair, leveled, then dropped. No voice followed. Still, my pulse climbed. Either the storm outside was trying to tear the mountain apart, or something else in here was waking up. I closed the notebook, slid it under my arm, and turned toward the stairwell at the end of the corridor. A painted arrow pointed down into levels with no labels. The air rising from below carried the smell of stone dust and something faintly electrical. Sector 13 hadn't been evacuated in a hurry. The stairwell felt like the throat of the mountain, narrow, steep, cut with utilitarian precision. My bootsteps rang in a slow, hollow rhythm. Each echo carried farther than seemed possible. The air grew cooler the deeper I went, picking up a damp mineral edge that reminded me of quarries back home. The lamp beam caught flecks in the concrete, small reflective grains that glittered like trapped stars. The first landing opened onto Level 2, Operations Support. The letters once read had faded to a brownish ghost of themselves. I pushed through the door and stepped into a hallway lined with reinforced glass. Behind each pane lay small workrooms, filing cabinets, abandoned desks, personal items left mid-use, pens uncapped, mugs half-washed. One office held a sweater draped over a chairback, sleeves dangling as if someone had stood and shrugged it off in a hurry. I couldn't tell if the people here had meant to return or if they'd understood too late that they wouldn't. A cluster of binders on a nearby desk caught my attention. Their labels read Anomaly Surveillance, Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3. I opened the first and scanned the contents, technical jargon, sensor readings, timestamps, the usual language of scientific curiosity. But then halfway through, the tone shifted. Visual-only geometry persists. No instrument interaction. Recommend halting direct observation beyond 5 minutes. Researchers report nausea, disorientation, loss of time. I paused. Loss of time. My hand tightened on the binder. The second volume contained insertion tests. Drones fitted with high-lumen lamps. Cameras layered with redundancies. Motion sensors tuned for micro-vibrations. All reported the same thing. Nothing. A perfect lack of data. As if the cavern center refused to be measured. Only human eyes seemed to see the spherical absence hovering above the cavern floor. The binder described it as a void in space that behaves neither as a physical matter nor as absence of matter, just an uncooperative region. Another researcher had scribbled in the margin, not a hole, a void. The third binder held a different tone, clinical urgency, notes on the volunteers who had stepped near or into the phenomenon. Their behavior changes, their eyes turning black, not like pupils expanding but like pigment filling the whole structure, their veins branching dark under the skin like roots pressing against glass. Then the worst part. Subjects attempted acquisition behaviors toward nearby personnel, intention unclear. All attempted to convey personnel toward the anomaly. Neutralization required. I set the binder down carefully, almost gently, as though the paper itself might bruise. A faint hum broke the silence. Not a whisper or a voice, just the subtle vibration of old electronics trying to wake. I followed the sound to a monitoring station. Screens lined an arc of consoles, all dead except one. Its surface flickered faintly under a sheen of frost. When I brushed it with my glove, a single line of text blinked into view. Final log, restricted access. I didn't press anything, didn't breathe. The text blinked again, as if expecting a user who hadn't shown up in years. Then the hum died. The screen went black. The room exhaled, settling back into its stillness. For a long moment I stood there, the lamp beam trembling slightly in my hand. Everything about this place felt like someone had hit pause during a moment of sheer panic, and whatever they'd been reacting to was still somewhere below. The stairwell beckoned at the far end of the hall, colder than before. My breath fogged in the beam. I tightened my pack straps and moved toward it. Sector 13 hadn't merely been abandoned, it had been interrupted, and I was walking into whatever had interrupted it. The next level down felt different the moment I stepped into it. It wasn't colder, wasn't warmer, but heavier, as if the air had settled into a thicker version of itself. Dust clung to the walls in long strokes, like someone had dragged their fingers through it while passing at a sprint. My lamp beam traced the marks. They were spaced too far apart to be from one hand alone. Something about that fact sat wrong with me. A sign on the wall pointed toward research storage. That seemed as good a place as any to understand what had happened here, so I followed the arrow. The storage room door was propped open by a metal stool knocked on its side. Inside, shelves sagged under the weight of notebooks, binders, loose sheets. Some had slid to the floor in small avalanches of paper that crinkled under my boots. I knelt and picked up a spiral notebook with a cracked spine. The first page was dated 6 months before the accident mentioned upstairs. Initial anomaly mapping incomplete. Cavern B9 contains central region of visual distortion. No thermal signature. No measurable mass. Eyewitness descriptions consistent. Spherical absence approximately 4 meters wide, maintaining fixed position above cavern floor. The idea of a floating sphere of nothingness was unsettling enough, but the next entries darkened into something worse. Drone insertion, total telemetry dropout 2 meters into sphere. Recovery tether returned liquefied at end, sample vitrified. Electromagnetic sweeps inconclusive. No reflection, no absorption, no emission. Void may not be empty. Possibility of non-terrestrial geometry. I flipped forward. The handwriting changed, sharper, angrier strokes. Volunteer exposure test failed. Subjects returned altered. Blackening of sclera and vascular networks. Changes not consistent with any known pathogen, toxin, radiation, or psychological break. They tried to take Pharaoh. Had to stop them. Stop them, another clinical word for something violent. A photograph slipped from between the pages. 3 soldiers stared back at me, rigid as mannequins. Their eyes were wrong, glossy black orbs reflecting the camera flash. The veins along their necks and wrists had darkened to a root-like pattern that branched beneath the skin. I found another journal, this one filled by a researcher named Harlan. His tone was different, half report, half confession. We were told to classify it Apollyon level, not containable. We were only able to isolate it. Built vault around anomaly to restrict access. No further human trials after casualties. Voices emerging from the vault after Phase 3. Not auditory hallucination, originating through electronics, vents, structural resonance, or some sort of psychic attack. Colleagues hearing familiar voices, family members, deceased. The thing is aware of us somehow. A paragraph farther down. Autopsies inconclusive, bodies normal, no foreign cells, no toxins. We misunderstood early. Whatever infection is present doesn't stay in flesh after death, it leaves. That line made my throat tighten. Whatever leaves a body after death doesn't need a circulatory system. It doesn't need to breathe. It only needs structure, something to inhabit, something to spread through. Harlan's final pages were frantic. Black substance emerging from vents, not biological, behaves like viral agent at structural level, infects metal, plastic, glass, violates known physics, found residue on camera housings, power grid failing. Survivors rigging charges to collapse cavern and seal vault will bury the thing if possible. The last line chilled me. Blizzard outside unnatural, temperature drop too severe, might be containing spread for now. If storm ends, so does our buffer. We are out of time. The entry ended mid-sentence. I stood slowly. The ceiling creaked above me, dust raining down in a thin veil. The air tasted faintly metallic, as if the room had exhaled after being forced to hold its breath for years. Whatever happened here hadn't ended. It had been frozen mid-motion, and I was thawing it by walking through its remains. I left the journals where they lay, though part of me wanted to pack them all and run topside immediately. But the storm was still clawing at the world above, and Sector 13 had turned itself into a kind of trap made of obligation and dread. If I left without understanding what this place had become, I had the sick feeling the answers would follow me out anyway. The hallway outside research storage curved into an access tunnel reinforced with thick-ribbed supports. Dust clung to the beams in lopsided drifts. The air vibrated faintly, the way it does near a transformer, except there was no power here. Not a working bulb, not a humming panel, not a living circuit. The sensation wasn't electrical, so much as imitative, like something practicing the idea of electricity without actually producing it. A sign hung crooked above a wider passage. Vault access. Authorized only. Someone had crossed out authorized with a thick black marker and written no one above it. That didn't fill me with confidence. The vault door itself stood another 50 feet down the tunnel. It looked like the kind of thing meant to survive a nuclear winter, slab-thick, triple-bolted, sealed with enough steel to hold back a god. Or try to. As I approached, my lamp caught on scratches around the frame. They weren't claw marks nor human fingernails, nothing so dramatic. More like the surface had swollen and contracted over time, leaving rippled blemishes as though the metal had been exposed to heat and cold cycles it shouldn't have been able to survive. The wheel lock was disengaged. It wasn't broken or forced, simply turned. Someone had opened it after the evacuation. I pressed the door lightly. It gave a fraction of an inch, emitting a long, low groan. The temperature dropped sharply, the cold spilling from the seams like whatever lay on the other side survived by draining heat. A thin vibration flowed through the floor, subtle, steady like an engine idling far away, except it didn't repeat in any natural rhythm. The pulse felt exploratory, probing. I stepped back, instinct overriding curiosity. The corridor light, meaning my headlamp, glanced off something on the floor near the vault, a smear of black. Not oily, not wet. Matte, like a shadow made physical. The smear had thin filaments branching outward as if it had tried to grow before freezing in place. My stomach tightened. The journals hadn't exaggerated. The infection didn't just live in bodies. I crouched and studied it without touching. The filaments didn't point randomly. They angled toward cracks in the concrete, toward the vault door, toward the structural seams, as if they had sought pathways, then stopped mid-reach. I stood quickly. A tone drifted down the hallway behind me, soft, synthetic, like a radio waking from deep sleep. No words, no cadence, just a rising pitch that plateaued before cutting off abruptly. The ducts above my head shook once, dust sifting down in a thin stream. The facility was dead. But something inside it wasn't. I continued past the vault, not daring to open it further, and followed the tunnel to its far end where the floor sloped downward. A hand-painted sign read, "Cavern Observation Deck." Whoever wrote it had shaky handwriting. The last few letters were smudged as though they'd been rushing. Halfway down the slope, the air thickened again, not physically but perceptually, as if visibility strained even though my lamp shone clear. Each step carried a sense of nearing something enormous, not in size, but in presence. The journals had called it a void. Standing there, looking down toward the cavern mouth, I wondered if void was too gentle a word. Whatever was down here were awake, and it had noticed me. And now the mountain felt like it was leaning toward me, urging me to keep going, or warning me not to. The descent ended at a reinforced steel railing overlooking Cavern B9. My lamp swept outward into a massive hollow space carved by miners, and then by something else entirely. The cavern swallowed the light more aggressively than it should have. Shadows behaved wrong, clinging to surfaces in a way that made every edge look uncertain, as if the rock down there couldn't decide whether it wanted to exist. A grated platform wrapped the upper half of the chamber. Workstations sat in a half-moon along the railing. Metal desks, overturned stools, 2 monitors cracked open like split skulls. Clipboards lay where they'd been dropped, pages curled inward, the ink blurred as if heat had licked across them without scorching the paper itself. Below, where the cavern widened out into a clearing of blasted stone, the center hung empty. It wasn't a pit, not a hole, nothing so polite. My eyes tried to give it shape, a sphere maybe, but the more I stared, the more it seemed like the idea of a sphere rather than an actual one. A kind of black that wasn't color but nothingness. A space that denied being seen except by staring directly into it. Instruments couldn't pick it up because instruments followed the laws of physics. The void didn't, which begged the question, how were we able to see it? In sudden clarity I realized it wanted us to see it. Only us. But why? I gripped the railing tighter. The journals had warned about nausea, disorientation. I felt neither. But I did feel watched. Not by anything with eyes, but by something so vast I couldn't describe it. The anomaly felt as if it were a door someone had left cracked open, and something huge on the other side leaned toward the gap. Along the cavern floor, I saw the aftermath of the volunteer team. 8 scorched marks arranged in a half circle. No bodies remained, but the stone bore the memory of heat and impact. Some of the scorch patterns were elongated, dragged toward the sphere's perimeter as if the subjects had been pulled in that direction even after they'd fallen. I exhaled slowly, grounding myself. I'd seen rock falls crush men. I'd seen methane pockets blow out tunnels, but I'd never seen marks such as these before. On the platform beside me sat a final notebook, this one sealed in a plastic evidence bag. I tore the brittle seam carefully. The cover was labeled Directorate, Phase Final. The handwriting inside was ragged but clear. The anomaly is aware. Not intelligent in human terms, but something vast, perceptive. The voices are not hallucinations. They emerge through structures, vents, electronics, even the rails. I rested my gloved hand on the railing, feeling its faint vibration. Had it always been there? We believed the infection was biological. It isn't. It infects the structure itself. The bunker is compromised. My pulse quickened. Charges have been set below. Survivors intend to collapse the cavern and bury the anomaly. Upper floors also rigged. If we detonate early, we trap ourselves. If we wait too long, we risk contamination spreading through the facility. The next lines were slower, heavier. The blizzard is unnatural. No meteorological explanation. Temperature drop extreme and sustained. We believe it is being used as containment. Something outside responding to prevent spread. If storm ends, infection may emerge. The last entry wasn't dated. We can't hold any longer. Researchers succumbing to internal influence, hearing family voices, seeing movements that aren't there. Director missing. Harris detonated lower charges prematurely. Cavern collapsing. If anyone finds this, finish what we couldn't. The sentence ended abruptly as if torn away mid-stroke. A thin crack echoed across the cavern, stone shifting under pressure. My lamp flickered. I stepped back instinctively. The void pulsed, a subtle contraction like something breathing inward. For the first time, I felt a whisper of heat along my neck. No sound, just the sensation of being recognized. I backed away from the railing slowly, one hand on the cold steel, the other gripping my lamp hard enough to make the casing creak. The void didn't move, didn't grow, didn't do anything dramatic. But the chamber felt subtly rearranged, as if the mountain itself had inhaled. The air pressed closer around me, heavy with the sense that I'd stepped into something not meant for human minds. I climbed back toward the upper levels, forcing myself not to look behind me. The sloping corridor seemed narrower on the return, its concrete walls faintly slick beneath the dust, as though some thin film had settled there while I was inside the cavern. I kept my eyes on the beam of my lamp, breathing steadily, counting each step until I reached the junction leading back toward the vault. That was when I noticed the change. The smear of black substance I'd seen earlier wasn't frozen in place anymore. It had spread, just a few inches but unmistakably. The filaments had crept across the concrete toward the doorway, delicate as spider silk, branching in thin lines like a frost pattern growing in reverse. The sight made something deep in my gut twist. I stepped around it carefully. My lamp caught another smear farther up the wall, much fainter, as though something had brushed past and left a trace. I hadn't seen it before. Either I had missed it or it hadn't been there. The realization settled like cold iron in my spine. Sector 13 was fully awake. When I reached the ops room, the air felt heavier still, as if thickened by humidity that wasn't actually there. Papers that hadn't moved earlier now curled inward slightly, edges rising. The cracked radio unit gave off a faint clicking, like old circuitry testing itself. The intercom panel above one of the desks glowed with a single red dot, dim but unmistakably on. It hadn't been lit before. I approached slowly, unsure what I expected. The panel emitted a soft electronic hiss. It wasn't voices, at least nothing human, but a layered wash of frequencies that came and went in a pattern eerily similar to breathing. The sound shifted subtly when I stepped closer, adjusting itself like something tuning to my presence. I reached up and yanked the panel's wire free. The hiss stopped instantly. Every hair on my arms rose. It felt like pulling a stinger from a wound rather than disabling a piece of hardware. The room exhaled, though the air didn't move. It was just a sensation, a pressure giving way. I turned toward the loading bay, wanting distance, wanting fresh air, even if it was 50 below blizzard air. But as I stepped into the corridor, something made me pause. Until that moment, I'd been seeing Sector 13 as abandoned, a place frozen mid-evacuation, dust settling on old chaos. But now the illusion cracked. My lamp revealed them, shapes on the floor, slumped against walls, sprawled near doorways. Bodies, soldiers, researchers. 15 at least. Maybe more. They weren't covered by dust or decay the way they should have been after years. Instead, they looked untouched, preserved by the cold and something else I couldn't name. My breath caught in my throat. Before, the floors had been empty. I'd walked these halls, seen only frost and clutter. But now I saw the truth. It wasn't that the bodies hadn't been there. It was that something had kept me from perceiving them, as if a veil had been laid over the world and only now had been lifted. I staggered back a step, bile rising in my throat. The filaments of black sheen trailed from door frames, from cracks, from the very seams of the walls. They didn't move, but they seemed to quiver in my peripheral vision, as though adjusting to my awareness. A shape on a nearby table caught my eye. A detonator, secondary, exactly like the journals had described. The survivors had set charges on the upper levels too, meant to finish the burial if the cavern collapse wasn't enough. I reached for it with a shaking hand. Sector 13 wasn't abandoned, it was waiting, and now it knew I could see it. The detonator weighed less than I expected. Plastic casing, metal studs, a rubberized trigger. A tool meant to end something terrible. My hand trembled around it, maybe from cold, maybe from everything else. Either way, Sector 13 had shifted from an archaeological curiosity to a loaded weapon pointed at the world, and I just picked up the safety. The bodies in the corridor seemed to watch me without eyes. The soldiers lay as if dropped mid-stride, muscles locked in their final motions. The researchers sprawled over desks, guardians of notes no one was meant to read. Their faces were slack but not decomposed, frozen with an eerie clarity that made me feel like I was trespassing into their last moment. The black filaments traced along their uniforms and skin, not thick, not overt, delicate, like roots exploring soil. It was subtle enough that I wondered again if I had walked past these same forms before without noticing. Had the filaments drawn my attention away, bent perception, distorted the room, or had the anomaly been waiting until I was far enough in to show me the truth? Either possibility was worse than the other. I forced myself to look away from the bodies and toward the direction the failed survivors had never made it, deeper into the facility, toward the vault, toward the anomaly. The black filaments along the walls seemed to point the same way. I tried the radio on my shoulder out of instinct, even though I knew it wouldn't work. The speaker crackled with brief static, not the helpful kind, but the kind that feels like the inside of a weather front, then died. No connection, no rescue, no sound except my own breath scraping behind the mask. I tightened my grip on the detonator and followed the main hall, stepping over sprawled forms carefully. The deeper I went, the more the bunker felt less like a place and more like the insides of some gigantic beast. My lamp beam caught more growths, thin dark stains that spread outward like frost fractals in negative. Some grew toward the floor. Others reached upward into ventilation grates. Everything seemed to lean toward the vault. As I approached it again, a pressure crept into my skull, a presence, like the bunker itself was trying to start a conversation I didn't want to hear. I stopped at the threshold. The vault door now stood several inches ajar. It had been barely cracked before. Now it gaped just wide enough for a man to slip through. My stomach dropped. I stepped back, fumbling to raise my lamp, and the beam slid along the interior surface of the vault. The once sterile metal walls were veined with black filaments, curling inward, converging like tributaries to a river. A sound drifted from beyond the door. It wasn't whispering, nor a voice. Something far stranger, like a recording, slowed down until the consonants stretched into vibration. A familiar pattern hiding inside the distortion, and then it changed. The timbre flattened, smoothed, and circled back on itself until it resembled something horrifyingly recognizable. My mother's cadence. Not her voice, not exactly. More like the memory of it played on a damaged recorder. A pull tightened around my chest. I staggered against the doorframe, the lamp faltering in my grip. My mother had been gone for almost a decade. The fact didn't matter to whatever was calling to me. The tone swelled again, half rhythm, half vibration, drawing me forward. A single thought slipped in unattended. She's waiting. A warmth spread through my limbs, numbing the cold. The black filaments on the walls seemed to pulse, faintly, almost welcoming. I took one step forward, then another. The lamp beam wavered, catching the cavern map painted on the vault's inner wall. A path descending, a walkway torn from rock, a door that was never meant to be opened by human hands. The air tasted sharp, metallic. Something coiled around my mind, gentle as a guiding hand, just a little farther. I teetered on the edge of willingness. One more step, and something inside me snapped taut, like a frayed rope holding by its last thread. A single rational thought forced its way up like fire through oil. That wasn't her. The warmth vanished. The cavern ahead waited in silence. The anomaly waited with it. The realization hit like a slap of cold air inside my skull, clean, hard, undeniable. Whatever was reaching for me wasn't my mother. It wasn't anything shaped by memory or love or grief. It was something that had learned the outline of human longing and traced it back at me with perfect, predatory patience. I stumbled backward from the vault door, nearly dropping the lamp. The warmth that had wrapped itself around my limbs drained away, leaving me shaky and hollow. The dark stain on the walls, those delicate branching filaments, trembled at the edge of my vision, like they were resentful at losing their hold. I clutched the detonator tighter. The echo of that false cadence faded, replaced by a silence so deep it felt like the facility was listening. Then, movement, something subtle, like the retreat of a tide across stone. A shift in the air that hinted the anomaly understood I'd slipped free of its pull, and now it was deciding what to try next. No, I wasn't giving it the chance. I ran. Sector 13 stretched ahead of me, no longer the quiet tomb it had seemed when I arrived. The hallways thrummed faintly, pulses of pressure moving through the ducts and the floor, like the bunker had grown its own heartbeat. The black filaments along the walls quivered as I passed. A few cracked under my boots like brittle twigs. Others recoiled, shrinking away from the lamplight. The bodies no longer looked preserved. They looked posed, arranged almost strategically between junctions. Whether that was true or just my nerves turning shadows into choreography didn't matter. I didn't slow down. The storm's muffled howl seeped through the steel door at the loading bay, a reminder that outside was no safer. The blizzard wanted me dead. The anomaly wanted me changed. I'd take the first option over the second. Halfway down the main hall, something slithered across the floor behind me, the soft scrape of matter rearranging itself. I didn't look back. My lungs burned as I sprinted past the mess hall, past the infirmary, past the stacks of notebooks that held the last terrified hours of people who had understood too late what they'd unleashed. The lamp beam jittered wildly. Sector 13 was after me now. I reached the loading bay at last, boots skidding on the frost. The door was nearly snowed shut. but I slammed my shoulder into it 3 times until it lurched open with a screeching metallic protest. A blast of white hit me like a thrown net. The wind dragged at me immediately, trying to pull the door closed again. I slipped through, hauling the pack tight to my shoulders, the detonator clenched in one fist. Behind me, something hit the inside of the door. I pushed into the storm. The white swallowed everything. I could barely see my own hands, but the cold felt clean after the bunker's strange heavy air. My breath tore from my lungs in sharp clouds. My legs moved on instinct alone, driving me away from Sector 13, from the mountain's buried throat, from the anomaly waiting in its hollow. When I reached what felt like a safe distance, maybe 50 yards, maybe 5, I turned just enough to see the faint outline of the bunker's entrance, a dark rectangle smudged by wind and snow. The detonator was cold in my hand. I pressed the trigger, a second of nothing. Then a rolling concussion tore the air apart. The ground shook under my boots. Snow leapt upward in a plume. A deep, gut-level roar traveled through the mountain's core as charges buried in the upper levels ignited one after another. The doorway collapsed inward, swallowed by falling rock and ice. Then the entire slope sagged as Sector 13 folded under its own weight, entombed with whatever still writhed inside. The blizzard carried the last echo away. I stood there, chest heaving, snow crusting on my mask, telling myself it was done. Then the wind shifted, and the blizzard, unnatural, impossible, protective, began to weaken. And then I heard a whisper in the wind, "Go." It didn't feel like the same malevolent presence inside Sector 13. It felt warm and protective, but I knew now. This was the same thing that had led me to Sector 13. The flares had been its doing. It had somehow contained that thing from the void with the blizzard, and then led me there. Why? So I could blow it up? I shook my head. I didn't know what it was or what it wanted, but I was getting out of here. I forced my way down the mountain, boots sinking into fresh drifts, Sector 13 fading into the white behind me. Unknown to him, a smear of black clung to his pack, no larger than a thumbprint. Matt, patient, harmless-looking. Caleb walked down the mountain alone, or so he thought. I'm Dr. Midnight. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.